My involvement started in around about 2006, so 10 years ago now, when the Scottish Government set out its Species Action Framework, and it listed some priority species for conservation intervention across the whole of Scotland. One of those species was the European beaver, which became extinct in Scotland some 300 to 400 years ago. And in line with a lot of other mainland European countries, there was a genuine desire and some leverage from European conventions to at least investigate whether or not it was viable to consider reintroducing the European beaver to Scotland. In response to the Species Action Framework, a partnership between the Royal Zoological Society of Scotland and the Scottish Wildlife Trust set about putting together a licence application from the Scottish Government to initiate a trial release of European beavers at this site. We had to also conduct a public consultation so that there was clearly a majority of support for the reintroduction of a species to an area that had not seen this species for a great many years. And we did manage to get that majority. So we were able to submit a licence at the end of 2008 to begin the process. In May of the following year, some beavers were brought across from Norway. They were wild caught. And it was after kind of consideration of where would be the best source of these beavers. We could go to pretty much any European country that had them, but there was some contention as to what the genetic provenance of some of these beaver populations might have been. And it was fairly safe to consider that the European population, which was geographically distinct from the rest of Europe, would be a good bet and probably a close match to the beavers that would have been found throughout Scotland several centuries ago. So the beavers were brought across from Norway and released in May 2009, and that began a 5-year intensive monitoring programme, mainly looking at the impacts the beavers had on the natural habitat and the ecosystem of Knapdale. One of the challenges that the trial faced was that this site is already very rich and very biodiverse, and it is part of it a site of special scientific interest. The majority of it is a special area for conservation. So already it was recognised through various designations as being very rich for certain other priority species. So it did mean there were some sensitivities about introducing an animal which is destructive, for want of a better word, but can have a very significant immediate impact on the environment. So it's important that these impacts were being monitored in a very detailed fashion. Ultimately, the trial partners were looking to be able to demonstrate positive impact and benefits by having beavers in a location as known ecosystem engineers, where they could manipulate and change the habitat in such a way that other species that perhaps already here, perhaps not doing quite so well, could benefit from the changes that were being made to the landscape as a whole. Beavers tend to have two key impacts, and the terrestrial woodland kind of fabric, and then in the freshwater habitat that they mostly can feed and forage and occupy. And behind me is a small loch called the Dúloch. Prior to the release of the animals, this loch was about a third of its current size because the water level was that much lower. And behind the camera is a loch known as the Coolivar, which is about a mile long. It's a significant body of water, perhaps the biggest loch in the whole of the Knapdale forest. The animals released somewhere on the edge of Coolivar, but it was fairly certain that the animals would take up residence in the Dúloch because it was much more secluded and more tranquil. And they did quite quickly start to build a lodge, which is on the other side of the loch, and build a dam, which is immediately behind me. In fact, we're virtually standing on the dam that was built in the first season that the beavers were here and they established this territory. And it's good to see that 7 years after that introduction, the dam is still intact. There's still evidence of some of the initial building that went on. But as you can see, it's starting to now become dominated by natural vegetation. So it kind of hides it really from kind of passing eyes. But it is still being maintained. There is tracks and signs of where beavers are coming from, their nocturnal, so their daytime residence in the lodge, through the dam, over the dam, and into Loch Coolivar. Going back to the idea of the public consultation, it wasn't just a precursor to the trial. It was imperative that we maintained a strong and an open relationship with the local community, so that the trial could be seen as a very transparent process, that any problems that did arise were addressed in a fast and appropriate fashion. And it was interesting going to some of the local stakeholder meetings held usually every 6 months to see the gradual lessening of those concerns as people became more aware of what beavers actually do when they're in your backyard, if you actually get a chance to see them. And the fact that, yes, they do fit in quite well into the landscape. And there was, I think, a genuine warming for anybody that was slightly concerned about the presence of beavers to the idea of having this, what we thought was a very exciting trial and a significant intervention in terms of conservation in Scotland happening in their backyard. So even those that weren't terribly concerned, we called them ambivalent, for want of a better phrase. Yeah, I think on the whole that the flavour of the meetings did generally change, and that there was a general acceptance that, yeah, the beavers were, if not necessarily a good thing, were not a bad thing to have in their backyard. There were some changes that had to be made, that the trial partners had to pay for, to compensate for in some ways. And part of this is where we're standing now, is the original walkway that allowed us, it's quite an old path that went round the Duloch, and it was a track that is now submerged under the water. So there's a new public access walkway that was built behind us, recognising that public engagement, this whole process, and giving people visitor access to the site was paramount. It wasn't about building a fence around the whole of Knapdale and excluding people because this was now a beaver residence. It's saying it is perfectly possible and perfectly viable for beavers and local communities and tourists and visitors to come and enjoy this site together. And the promotion of the trial and the presence of beavers was a key part of the touristic value of having beavers on site. The evidence was all gathered independently and impartially by subcontractors, collated into individual reports and an overall report fed back to Scottish Government. And those papers are available online, so all the evidence is there in the public domain. Overall, there's measures of positivity. There are certainly increases in some of the freshwater invertebrates and other airborne invertebrates, responding mostly to the increase in pool areas such as this, and the inherent consequence of biodiversity increases that come from it. The amphibian population has probably increased. It's been difficult to say. The first 2 winters of the trial were very, very cold, and we had some kind of natural, quite high amphibian die-offs, which was a little bit kind of concerning at the time, but we haven't had winters quite as bad as that. And it did make monitoring of the beavers very difficult in 2009, 2010, just getting access to this site. I mean, this loch was completely frozen, so it wasn't possible to actually take canoes out of it. Interestingly, and maybe partially as a consequence of the beavers having come from Norway, the frozen loch didn't impede them in any way. In fact, it probably benefited them, and it enabled some of the food that they had stored in terms of felled trees the previous summer was probably staying fresher as a result of the very low temperatures. So there were about 4 release sites altogether, clustered fairly close together, so that it was close enough for dispersing animals to find each other, but not so close that they felt as if they were in conflict with each other. And I think at least 3 of the pairs that were set up did successfully produce kits and rear those kits. And a lot of these animals now have dispersed to other parts of Knapdale. Some we don't know the final outcomes on. I mean, it's quite a big, extensive area. We didn't have direct monitoring of any of these individuals, and there's no kind of tags attached to them. At the moment, there's no evidence of where these animals might be. They may no longer be alive. Some of them could simply be still actively finding and establishing new territories somewhere on site. It has to be remembered that this was a trial. This was not an attempt to reintroduce European beavers to Scotland. This was simply an experiment to be able to generate some data that could tell us what the impacts of beavers in a site such as this are going to be. So in some ways it was never an intended outcome that this would be the beginning of a viable population that would slowly spread across west of Scotland and across the whole of Scotland. So it wasn't critical that all these beavers survived and established a viable population. That hopefully will come. The report has gone to the Scottish Government as a result of the trial. We're waiting now for a decision from the Ministry for the Environment to say whether or not it is happy for the European beaver to stay as a priority species and for a clear strategic reintroduction of this species to happen in Scotland. It is important because in some ways it is a flagship and a kind of a vanguard for the potential for other species. Some say it's more contentious species such as European lynx back into Scotland. So as a reintroduction, you know, this was the first time a mammal had been formally reintroduced to Scotland on a trial basis, and it does set the scene for what else could be done in this and other Scottish landscapes in order to kind of achieve some of the goals of rewilding and repopulating, where you have keystone species. So whether it's a beaver that is engineering the environment or European lynx that help to control populations of other species, it's important that we take the outcomes of this trial very seriously. And it's good today, it's a beautiful day, that we're actually seeing quite a few visitors coming to this site that have been, it's raised the profile of Knapdale and Mid-Argyll, and I think that the beavers have been useful ambassadors for making that happen. This is a bit of silver birch that's been foraged by some beavers, and you can tell from the larger part where it's been removed from the tree, just some incisor scars on the tip, and then some just strategic single bites up the branch where they've just nipped off some of the smaller branches that they would have just ingested and eaten straight away. So it's a part of kind of just general open foraging of the beavers rather than kind of whole-scale harvesting of entire trees. But this was just at the base of the dam, so again en route where, you know, beaver would have dragged it back to the shore, had a little bit of a nibble on it and then gone on to do other things. Or it may have had a bigger branch with it and it's just decided to nip this bit off, feed on it and take the rest of the branch with it.